Hello, hello, everybody. Today we got a special one. I will be debating a college conservative not associated with any mainstream, or not sanctioned, excuse me, by any mainstream college organizations, college conservative organizations. But it's happening. They're in the Zoom call. For whatever reason, Zoom is not showing their face. I don't quite know why. Uh, I'll go ahead and say hello. Hey, what's up? I'm just making sure that your face cam is able to be shown on the stream. Um, Zoom's kind of acting up, so I might have to try an alternative way. But we'll be able to start the debate momentarily. I have the stream running, just so you know.
Mm.
Might have to just show. Trying to remember some stuff about OBS display capture. There you go. Yep. Okay. This is showing the stuff here. Let me just turn my camera on here. Okay. Let me bring this down. Do this. Do this. Do that. Make it a little bit thinner here. This. Do that. And there we go. I think that works out. So let me make sure the stream's running well on YouTube. It's going. Hello to the 5 concurrent viewers. I did not expect to have this much so quick. Shout out to the Vosh subreddit. I appreciate you guys coming. We will be debating in a moment. Just let me put this link in my Discord server. At everyone. Live right now. Okay. So, what do you have on your mind? What do you want to talk about?
Okay. All right. So let me start with identity politics.
Sure.
Just off the top.
What's on your mind about identity politics?
So what I find terrible is the fragmentation of the United States and mostly the fragmentation of the world into identity groups, when I really think we can accomplish much more together if we are just considered as humans together. I mean, the fact that we have to deal with all these different groups, from minority groups like Black, White, Asian, Latino, Latina, and bisexual groups, gay, lesbian, bisexual, all the other letters. It just serves, from my observation, it just serves a classic divide and conquer strategy, from the people who push it, mainly the left, mainly Democrats, to be specific. So this kind of divide and conquer idea is very classic, and right now it's very noticeable to people who are like in the know, to people who are really paying attention to it, while for others it's just this nonsense. Just leave me alone. I want to live my life. Stop talking to me. And that is what I find is really hurting people. It's the separation and the apathy, to where you have the separation people are actively pushing for, separating us into groups. Then the apathy that says, I don't care, leave me alone. And then the apathy lets all this stuff happen. And then before they know it, everyone's divided, everyone's at each other's throats, and their own lives are terrible. to where they can't even go into a restaurant because you need to check a box, or they can't even hang out with people they like because those people are terrible, and by association, you are terrible. So
Well, what do you mean by
that's
going
what
to
I
a
think about it.
restaurant and check a box?
Hmm?
What do you mean by going to a restaurant and check a box?
Well, in this specifically, this would be the masking and vaccine debate.
Well,
Because what I find about those two is that it has morphed from a debate on effectiveness, which I think has pretty much been settled. Vaccines are effective. There are side effects. That's normal for any sort of therapeutic or medicine. It works, but there are side effects. Done.
hmm
For masks, it's not really a debate on does it work or doesn't. It's a debate on degree of how it works. You have KN95s, which are better. You have cloth masks, which are not as good.
hmm
So, but the problem is when you have this dichotomous idea of the people who wear masks are good and the people who don't wear masks are bad, to where eventually you don't get from what the main choice is, what I think is a freedom of choice debate, it becomes a good versus evil debate, which really forms to polarize people and put people into specific extremes they wouldn't be in. I honestly don't think you would have an anti-mask movement if the pro-maskers weren't pushing so hard to put
Yeah.
on the mask. If they weren't saying you are a terrible person if you don't put on the mask, they would say the people who are anti-mask at this point, it wouldn't push. I swear I told this woman. Just a second.
No problem. Yeah, I apologize for potential freezing. My internet, it
Okay.
really just isn't that good, so hopefully the stream will still play out normally though. My apologies to the viewers about the kind of lagging a bit, but that's fine. But sorry, you were
Okay.
saying though.
All right. So yeah, the morphing of the mask and vaccine debate from a debate on effectiveness, which I believe has been settled, to a debate on whether you do it or not, that has become a problem.
Well,
Like I
okay,
said, I don't think there will be a serious anti-mask movement if they weren't pushing so hard.
well, we could try going step by step, right? So,
Mhm.
um, with the mask stuff, I think it's less of a good and evil thing, and it's just frankly it's almost like a we want to get rid of this pandemic. If you're not going to play your role, then you are somewhat of a problem, in my opinion. And the thing is, the way the Biden administration's doing it, I think is very considerate to the hesitant side, considering that it was made in mind to have the option of whether you want to get the vaccine or you want to get test instead. So I mean, I don't see much like there's a lot of this sort of the only like people that are really like trying to make real hardcore divisions, acting as if like being vaccinated or not being vaccinated is some kind of like new Jim Crow or anything like that, are mainly people on the right that are trying to say, "Oh, you want me to to go have to be vaccinated to work around people, then I'm pretty much the new Anne Frank." That sort of division between vax and unvax seems to me to be only coming from one direction. But besides that, I don't really think that the sort of vaccinated and unvaccinated debate is really in the same room or in the same area as the debate among other identities, whether it's sexualities or whether it's
Mm.
race. Um, so do you want to go down more for now the vaccine discussion or getting vaccinated or the race discussion? Because I can go down wherever you would prefer.
I think I'm going to prefer the race discussion right now.
Sure. So your problem with identity politics is that, or specifically like racial identity politics, is that it divides people or something around those lines?
It Yes, when I just think it would just be it seems to me more of a divide and conquer strategy
Well,
than
who's doing the
anything
divide and
actually
conquer?
productive. It would be, in my opinion, the left who pushes the. I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it. It pushes the CRT, pushes the white oppressor, black, Hispanic, minority oppressed idea. it sadly, yes, it has happened, but in this day and age, it is not as it's just not there. It's really
Uh,
just not there.
I think a lot of
Um,
people would strongly disagree with that. Number one,
Absolutely.
number two, I don't. Can you elaborate on what you think CRT is?
CRT, it is basically the idea that as simplified as it is the idea that the white idea of society, the Western culture of society, is inherently oppressive, is inherently terrible, and must be abolished in a way to make minorities and those who were oppressed by that system more powerful, sort of to level the playing field. But in this case, it just turns into a reverse racism to where it becomes white people are denigrated and minorities are lifted up in the same reversed way that back in the day people thought white people were the best and the minorities were terrible. It's just the reversal.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think that's the meaning at all. The meaning of CRT is it's an academic movement of civil rights scholars and activists who seek to critically examine the intersection of race and U.S. law to challenge the mainstream ideas. It's a way of examining social, cultural, and legal issues, primarily as they relate to race and racism. So it's not really this thing that's like teaching people, white people, bad. It's just a way of examining law, essentially. Seeing, like, let's say the war on drugs. The war on drugs isn't explicitly saying we want to arrest black people, but what it does, the effects of many of the laws is mass incarceration, the harming of sorry the effects are mass incarceration and separation of families. You know, if one of your parents is going to prison because they are desperate and in need and they sell drugs, for instance, like something like marijuana, and they get sent to prison, that has very much long-term effects on you. But then you also examine why exactly are they in that position of poverty. And that's pretty much, it's a very simplified version, but that's what critical race theory is. You're looking at how race and racism and history behind it affects people today. But so critical race theory isn't just saying like white people in Western society equals bad and must be destroyed. I think that kind of shows a not really much of an understanding of what critical race theory is and kind of just towing the Republican line when you said that. But I mean, do you have any objections to that or anything like that?
When it comes to the mass incarceration idea,
Uh-huh.
that is simply a product of an anti yeah, is simply a product of an anti-Western culture. When it comes to the good
Wait,
that
what?
Western culture has done,
I'm
raising
wait,
people out of
wait, hold on,
poverty,
hold on. I'm confused here. You
yeah,
just said that
yeah,
mass incarceration comes from anti-Western
Be-
culture.
because what happens, at least for now, because of basically what I'm trying to say here is that crime and bad choices are fostered in specifically Black communities as a response to the pressure put upon them by Western society to succeed.
Where does that information come from? Is this like the critical race theory lens, or is this like your lens?
Mm,
Well, I mean,
um,
to move the conversation, I think
yeah.
to addressing the point that was trying to be made, I don't think that looking
Mm,
at mass incarceration in a way that I looks at the racial aspect is necessarily
mm,
some anti-Western thing. It's just saying like policies happen. There's history behind those policies. There's uh, perhaps some intent that is just unspoken when the policies are being made, and it affects people mainly of um, racial group or another racial group, but also a minority, and it keeps that group down. I think that that's not really an anti-Western thing. That's just trying to analyze how things are. But I mean, I guess the one of the big problems with the overall critical race theory debate is that people don't actually care about it. If you noticed in the beginning
mhm.
of the summer, it became this huge thing. Everybody was talking about it. Suddenly, you have people that have never spoken the word critical race theory. It's the biggest thing to them. And they're making videos, and every single time you look in the videos, like let's say it's midsummer, I remember this. In the middle of the summer, I saw these like YouTubers making videos about critical race theory. You search critical race theory on their channel, and they've only been talking about it for 3 weeks, and they made like 50 videos on it. Um, the point I'm trying to make here is that uh, number one, people don't really seem to understand it. Number two, understanding it, it doesn't seem to be the intention of the right wing media. Number three, it's just this pseudo culture war issue without even actually saying what the issue is with critical race theory. It's just making the term CRT this scary word. And it's an example of the culture war and divide and conquer, I suppose, being used as a tool not by the left but by the right. Would you disagree with that statement?
I disagree with the divide and conquer on the right
Well,
because
well, they were
there
the
there
okay. Go ahead.
there is a fundamental difference between the right in America and the left in America. The fundamental difference is that the right does not want to control you. That is the difference, the big difference. The right does not want to control you. Every time I've seen anything that the left does, it always has this undercurrent of we want to tell you what to do, how to think, and how to act.
Really?
That, yes, that is the main difference between the right and the left. The right, yes, are the free thinking people because we don't want to be told by an overarching government that thinks they know everything what to do. We want to make our own decisions. This probably goes into the mass debate. But in this case, I do not think at all that the right wants to divide people and conquer them in any way that I've seen the left try and divide and conquer people.
Well, okay.
I don't think.
Going with that point, I mean,
Mhm,
you want less people controlling you besides or the right wants less people controlling the individual besides
mhm,
the boss telling you how many hours you gotta work or having the ability to fire you at any moment or having the ability to like screw up the trajectory of your entire life plans because you lost a important source of income. I mean, that control would still be there in an ideal right-wing society if we got rid of like government or lessen the power of government or anything like that. But like when it comes to just the divide and conquer strategies, I think that's important to address. If you're looking at American history, the weaponization of identity politics and divide and conquer strategies have not been done by the left nearly as much as the right. I can say that confidently. When you look at
mhm,
conservatism in 1860, divide and conquer was so effective that half the country split up and tried to and fought a civil war. If you look further on, the weaponization of white identity and trying to preserve white identity is very commonplace. and whether it's Anglo-Saxons discriminating against Germans and Italians in the early 20th century. Um, but eventually, when the civil rights movement was happening, and when in general black people and other minority groups were trying to gain more prominence, you saw, this is going into a bit of critical race theory here, but the idea of whiteness shifting away from just Anglo-Saxons, but also trying to include people like the Irish, the Germans, the Italians. And they use that white identity to keep people arguing and pushing for civil rights down. Um, so, I mean, and then we can look at the
Mhm.
modern examples. The entire conversation about critical race theory was just identity politics and divide and conquer strategies. The campaign of Donald Trump in 2016, even in 2020, used a lot of racial divide and conquer. For example, in 2020, he was very overt about his racism, frankly, when he's saying that they're coming for the suburbs. They're coming for the suburbs. So, I mean, when we just like look at the track record, the right wing has much more of a history of using identity politics as a weapon. The Democrats' use of identity politics is sometimes cynical. The more established Democrats just trying to say we don't hate gay people, so we're good. But that's not really uh overall, even if it's cynical, that's not necessarily a negative. It's probably good that one of the major parties explicitly does not hate gay people, you know?
Mm.
I want to address a point somebody made in my chat. Nathan, doesn't the idea of identity politics go against MLK's idea that we should judge people's character, and not we should judge people by their character and not by their skin color? So, of course, at the end of the day, that's the goal, to just see people as other people and not have to factor in race. But in the current present day and in MLK's time, that was not an option. That's why Martin Luther King, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, pushed legislation that went far and beyond the Civil Rights Act. He pushed a sort of Marshall Plan, but for African Americans. And that would have been way beyond what people think is too radical with something like affirmative action, for instance. Um, but like, yeah, judging people by their character does not mean ignoring the factors that make their lives the way it is. You know, recognizing that this person is black, they might have a higher chance of being discriminated against, or we have to make sure that the government steps in to prevent something like segregation from happening, but with using like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I believe. Um, but yeah, recognizing someone by their character does not mean ignoring something very important to them, very important characteristic. And MLK himself was way more radical than what we perceive him to be,
Mm.
at least what the school teaches us he is. And radical in a good way. But sorry, I don't
Mm.
want to keep talking too much. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, yeah. I've always had this problem of not being able to think on my feet very well.
No
That's
problem,
why I'm
no
always
problem. I understand.
silent. So on this idea, um, what I can really just make a general statement that I believe wholeheartedly that we can achieve MLKJ's vision very, very easily by just not focusing so hard on race.
I disagree with
And
that strongly, but
I,
go ahead.
I, yeah, he's.
Um, well, I guess to address that point there,
Mhm.
I don't think ignoring race is the answer to our racial divide or many racial related problems. Like, just ignoring that, oh, race is a factor in people's lives is not going to solve mass incarceration. Ignoring that race is a factor in people's lives is not going to get black people out of poverty or Hispanic people or different groups out of poverty. It's important to
But but
yeah, go
but
ahead.
but is race really the specific cause, or is it choices people make? Is it the people they're surrounded by? Is it the environment they're surrounded by?
Well, oh
It's
yeah,
not
environment plays a
it's not
factor.
just it's not just that's why the race issue muddles everything. It muddles the vision we need to see to say it's not race. It's not just because you were born a certain color. It's the decisions you make. And sadly, because it's the people you surround yourself with, that needs to be offset by a school system that doesn't play down to the stereotypes of black kids. They can't do reading, writing, and math, that they can't excel in school, and say, no, you can do it. You can excel in school. You can rise up out of, sadly, the ghetto you may have lived in into a suburban area, into a better place. It's not race itself is something that muddles any argument, and it's something that can be scapegoated to say, oh well, they aren't doing well because they're black, instead
No,
of they're
no.
not doing well because they live in a certain area, they're surrounded by certain people that pressures them to decel, that pressure them to commit crimes, that pressure
No,
them to do certain drugs and stuff like that.
no. I don't
it's
think
it,
that.
it it's got to be it's got to be the environment. And if we can find a way through good education, through certain trade schools that can teach them skills that they can use in a workforce, they can excel, they can get out of that environment.
Well,
And we just have to take our focus away from race and focus on the decisions they make and the environment they are, and say these decisions can be changed, your environment can be mitigated, and you can excel.
well, okay. Addressing that point, I don't think that there's like this line between recognizing that race is a factor and these other different factors like environment, for instance. And the environment things is something I would like to focus on, because
Mm.
we can look at the environment that many minority groups, especially the black community, find themselves in. So let's say like somebody lives in the inner city. Now, why do they live there? Well, if you look in history, we can see that during the era of Jim Crow, there was redlining that pretty much boxed black people into certain communities. So it turns out that they were in these communities with less opportunity and less ability to grow your family's wealth. And then, lo and behold, the people born today are also in worse off conditions and also in poverty. So the thing is, race is a factor in why they were even in that environment in the first place. The way black people were treated over the years, over the 20th century, is a factor on why a lot of black people are in the position which they're in. So, like, let's say, like, there was Black Wall Street, and when a black community was doing extremely well, what happened? White people burned it down, um, and nobody really got in trouble. So, a lot of times in American history, black people, for the reason of being black, were held back and prevented from growing. But
So
recognizing that history does not mean you're not willing to change the different factors. In fact, recognizing that history is a driving motivation to things like, hey, this community here uh, has been screwed over. So let's try to make sure that they have the proper programs they might need to equalize the starting line, so that every single person in that place has the opportunity to succeed, even if they were born into deep, deep poverty. But recognizing the racial factor is not ignoring these different factors. It's just understanding objective history.
mm,
But also really importantly, ignoring the race, just
mhm.
pretending like I'm not racist, therefore, well, I'm not racist. That guy claims to be not racist. Us as individuals are not racist, so racism is no longer a problem in the United States. If everybody started having that mentality, then maybe on an individual level you can probably get along better with whoever you want. But that doesn't address the systematic issues of our system. It doesn't address how mass incarceration screwed over the black community and is almost the what I would call the modern evolution of Jim Crow. It doesn't address that because you ignore the racial aspect, and that means that a lot of issues don't get fixed, don't get solved.
So And then when it comes to the in the end, when it comes to mass incarceration, it is still the choices people make that cause them to be incarcerated.
Well, what causes the choices?
While while the laws, what caused it's actually it's a lack of policing in those areas.
A lot of these communities have a lot of police.
It's an environment that fosters crime, that fosters, let's say, hidden drug running, that fosters gangs.
Uh-huh.
And then when black congressmen, when black community leaders see the environment created because of lack of policing and because of dangerous drugs like cocaine, like crack, that were in black communities, they were like, hold on, these drugs are destroying our communities. These drugs are destroying the people that we grew up next to because they got into this drug trade, because there weren't any police to crack that down very quickly to where you wouldn't have that many people getting hurt, to where you would, to where in this case, because the police were taken from those black communities into the wider communities, sadly, yes, because of that racism at the moment, to where they said, you know what, you guys got your freedom, you guys do what you want, but if you don't want us in there, then our cops can come over here and protect us. That terrible, 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 terrible decision, I will agree, that is a terrible, disgusting decision, caused this kind of shift to where you have such a sharp drop in black community standards of life, that when people wanted to change that, it caused that sharp uptick in the amount of people that were incarcerated. Basically, it is a disease that they didn't treat immediately. So it's a disease that starts at the fingers and then it slowly grows into until you have to cut off the entire arm.
Okay, well, this is
That
I guess to address some of the points made there. I'll try to be quick. You said that a lot of these things happened because there was a lack of policing. And then the crime happens, and then the gangs form, and then all that stuff. But then a lot of these places were policed, and then there was just continued mass incarceration. There was still lack of opportunity, and a lot of these communities are still falling apart. So I don't think the solution is just put police here, fix problem, or police presence alone fixes the problem. Do you know why many gangs formed in the first place? Or as kind of a rhetorical question. Like I have the answer in front of me, I can explain it. But do you have a guess on why many gangs formed in the first place?
no, I do not.
Many gangs gained a lot of control in like poor urban communities and developing communities in response to unemployment and other lack of social services, social disorganization, all that stuff. Essentially, socioeconomic factors. So then, these people are screwed in the economic level, and then they have to turn to these things like gangs for protection, for opportunity, for all that stuff. So besides that as well, you mentioned like people are in these environments, these are crime prone and all that stuff, and these people are then more likely to do crime. But like, why do you think that they are doing crime?
Yes, that lack of actual opportunity. That is it's a really vicious cycle to where you have this crime and then people want to come into the community and create a business. So then there's still no opportunity and then more crime. It's just a vicious, disgusting cycle, but it is stopped or at least slowed when the crime slows. And it must be advertised better to people who have the opportunity to say, all right, we are doing better policing here. We are providing certain services that keep people off the streets, that keep people from doing the the, the drugs and having these addictions. Please come here. Please. We have done the work of stopping this loop. Continue to stop it, continue to slow it by coming in. There is a lack of advertisement of these communities when actual reform and actual stopping of crime comes in. I will concede that, because when it comes to stopping this, when it comes to having this mass incarceration problem, there's no follow up. There's no follow up from the community leaders, from the people in these cities to say, all right, we've put, sadly, we had to do it. We had to put these people in jail, but guess what? Our streets are clean. Everyone's waiting for that opportunity. Come here,
Well,
get
okay.
a
Well,
business in
that
here,
that
get
that's
get a place in here.
that's pretty concerning when you say something like that, because when you say we had to put these people in prison, for example. So if, let's say you are
Mm-hmm.
a person that maybe you found yourself in a gang because you needed to survive,
Mm-hmm.
because of lack of opportunity. And maybe you
Mm-hmm.
had a kid while you were still free, and then you were put into jail, and now that kid's growing up without a parent. And then that
Mm-hmm.
already right there is a way to lower someone's potential economic opportunity. So it's almost like in an attempt to make things better, mass incarceration seemingly made things worse,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the thing is, the war on drugs was fueled a lot by these racist perceptions of black people and other minorities. So we had like Hillary Clinton, for instance, talking about super predators, that these people are like these young people that I don't remember her exact words, but there was this perception of these super predator people that had no consciousness. I think that was one of the words she used. And it wasn't a sentiment just pushed by Hillary Clinton, it was a sentiment all around the United States. But if your perception of people is just they are inherently without conscience and they're just violent for violence sake, then you're not going to
Mm-hmm.
address the socioeconomic factors that put them in the position where they need to turn to a gang for support. But the reason I'm talking about this is we're talking about this because this is the history of race in America. This is not
Mm-hmm.
far off. This was in the 90s, and it continues to this day. The war on drugs is still happening. Maybe one of the ways we can, and then much of the reforms that could be used to alleviate the war on drugs, decriminalization of drug use, is still not mainstream at the moment. People still want to
Mm-hmm.
arrest people for just using drugs. In fact, even if you're selling drugs, let's say you're someone that's selling weed, I don't think that that person has to be taken off the streets. That person should be able to start a legal business. That person should
Mm-hmm.
not be sent to prison. And the thing is, many of those people have been sent to prison and are still in prison. A lot of non-violent drug offenders. But the reason we're talking about this, like I said, is just because this is the history of race and identity in the United States. It's not just individuals saying like they don't like a certain group of people. It's individuals, it's systems that are holding people back. And even right now, like just bringing it to the modern day, much of the anti-CRT bills, are you aware that a lot of them in these Republican states are preventing textbooks from saying things like the KKK is morally wrong, or preventing things like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, or preventing things like his letter from Birmingham jail from being part of that textbook, meaning that not only do we have a history of putting black people down and other minority groups down, we're in our current day, in this whole CRT hype, this vilification
Mm-hmm.
of it, we are now seeing actual legislation being put into effect, and that legislation is preventing uh, even figures that have been frankly whitewashed by our educational system and our media from being discussed in schools, because apparently that's critical race theory according to Republican legislators. But the point I'm bringing that up is because race is still a problem, race is still a factor, and race is still on the mind of racists. So some might say stuff like, "Oh, we should just not see color, and that'll fix the problem." But then when they legislate, these Republican legislators, they are then preventing the most mainstream and famous civil rights leader from being spoken about in public education. And that's a that just says to me that race is still a factor in our lives, and we cannot afford to just pretend like it isn't.
Um, okay. So those specific provisions, those are those specific provisions are disgusting. They the evilness of the KKK and the gloriousness of Martin Luther King Jr. should be taught in schools. It's taught to me, and I love it. That's why it's very important to have transparency with these kind of with these kinds of um, bills, to see what is actually being written in the law, to where people can say, okay, you're lumping in the CRT that we see as bad with the actual teaching that we see is good. Okay, you're doing something wrong. So those provisions specifically are terrible.
Hmm.
But that just goes to show you that we need to be able to see the actual laws that are made and
But
what's
but do you agree
good,
with the idea
what's
that
bad.
CRT should be banned from things like public universities and colleges? These are like academic institutions where people do like actual research and analysis of the world around us. Do you agree with like I think Ron DeSantis was hyping himself up. He's like, I'm gonna ban CRT from everything, including college. Like, is that appropriate level, an appropriate measure to make? Because much of what I've been discussing, like when I mentioned earlier how Italians and Germans and Irish were discriminated against in the early 20th century, and they weren't considered white or treated as white, and eventually, oh, I dropped something. Eventually, the idea of whiteness changed to include them as a way to make sure that the white population is still the majority and more unified and excludes the
Mhm.
minorities, recognizing that the idea of whiteness changes to benefit, frankly, white supremacy, at least in the history of the United States. That's critical race theory right there. Should discussing that historical fact be banned from public universities like ours?
When it becomes simplified into action that denigrates people, specifically white people, because of their race, that's where I draw the line.
But it doesn't do that. It recognizes that like I said, I was addressing whiteness, the concept of that, not white people. But like Irish, Germans, I believe it was Benjamin Franklin who said about Germans that I forgot his quote, but essentially that they're not even white because they're so backwater and they're so behind or whatever. Um I recognizing that whiteness exists as an idea is basic critical race theory. So like, yeah, that's as
So so
basic as it
so
gets.
so how have you seen um, CRT in practice?
Well, CRT in practice is just people in university, among with other different, using a lot of different theories and a lot of different ways to analyze things. Just analyzing things like laws, for example. So a CRT in action is saying like, oh, the crime bill or mass incarceration in general, the war on drugs, these bills don't have anything in them that say, they don't have the I hate black people bill, but they have the many things that'll target a black community, or many of these laws will harm the black community or Hispanic community. Voter ID laws, for instance, I believe there was a North
Mm-hmm.
Carolina thing that was shot down by the Supreme Court way a little bit back in the day, um, because according to one of the courts, whether it's the North Carolina Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court, it's not exactly fresh on my mind. What they found was that black communities were being targeted, DMVs and such were being removed, these places where you would have to get the voter ID were being closed down in areas where it's black communities. So it would be harder and more difficult, especially for poor people and people in poverty, to get them, which in turn lowers the black voter turnout. So they shot down that bill because they called it, they said it was racism with surgical precision. So a critical race theory in action would be a person in a university looking at that bill and being like, hey, there is a racial angle to this bill. It is kind of discriminating against black people or other minority groups.
Mm-hmm.
And then that information just becomes public, and maybe a politician can act upon it and say, we should prevent this bill from happening because it could harm a big portion of our community. Um, and it's being done on purpose in many cases. So I mean, that's critical race theory in action. Critical race theory in action is not saying, "Hey, white people, give me your car because I have a strategic disadvantage as the son of a minority." You know, that's not what CRT is.
All right. Well, one thing that has gone around is uh, in certain circles, resegregation, I would call it.
Uh huh.
Black only graduations, black only dorms, um, elementary school students being separated by skin color. It's ridiculous. Have you seen that? Anyone?
I have not seen that. I've heard of
No.
like, oh, this is a like maybe there'll be like an area of a building that's like, oh, this is a space for black people to be around other black people, but overall, I think that I'm sure there's a lot. I'm sure you can find me like a handful or however many. Like even if you find me like 50 individual cases of something like this happening, I don't think that this is like a this is even equal or close to equal as systematic as segregation was in the United States in like the 50s and 60s and so forth.
Mm.
So and at the end of the day, when we look in a utilitarian perspective about harm and then good being
Mm.
done, like a group of a university having like an area of a building that's like a black only space and like some black people going in there and just hanging out, it doesn't have the same degree of harm done to society as, let's say, like segregation in back in the 60s where the white people had a decent bathroom and the black people had like poison water in their drinking water, you know. So I don't think it's really that equal.
All right.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, what about if that separation came with qualifiers,
What do you
where
mean
you
by that?
had the lighter skinned kids labeled as oppressors and the darker skinned kids labeled as oppressed?
Like
What about that?
light skin and dark skin black people specifically?
No, 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 no,
Oh,
no.
in
White
general.
people,
White people and
black
black people.
people labeled in the class in a classroom,
Yeah.
labeled as oppressed and labeled as oppressors. Where do you think that came? Where hypothetically, where do you think that would come
Well, in a hypothetical situation where that's happening in like a
from? Mm-hmm.
classroom, I disagree with someone labeling their students as oppressed and oppressors. And
Mm.
who knows, maybe you could find me a real life case of a teacher doing a little lesson where they show like I think there was like a famous case. Oh my god, I'm forgetting the name. Where there was like this lady back in the day that like separated her class trying to teach about racism and the Holocaust or something around those lines, and separated her class and said like, okay, you with brown eyes are this group, you with blue eyes are this group, and then you got treated worse or whatever. But the her lesson
Mm.
wasn't bad at all. Her lesson was trying to teach about the effects of racism and such. But I mean, I don't think that's necessarily what you're talking about in your hypothetical. In your hypothetical, it's just I'm assuming it's just like a teacher, and they feel like they for whatever reason want to separate their lighter skin and darker skin students into different sides of the classroom. I don't know why they would do that, number one. And number two, I disagree with them doing
Mm.
that. And number three, though, I mean, that's a very specific hypothetical. I don't think that that
Mm.
represents anything systematic, though. So,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
All
So,
right.
yeah. You mentioned, in the, in your Instagram message, you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
I'm also interested in the economic part, that stems from liberal government handouts but
Mm-hmm.
and keeping them down under with the mountain of free money. So what's your point in that?
All right. So my point in that is what I've dubbed economic atrophy. It is almost the same principle as building muscle. You need weight and pressure to build muscle. And in the case of economic atrophy, one would need weight and pressure to drive them to succeed economically.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have such a large cushion, not even just a safety net, to where I would think that would be considered more of an like an emergency fund kind of insurance thing to where you aren't guaranteed it unless you meet certain criteria, to where not only do you get it if you, let's say, go below the poverty line, God forbid,
Mm-hmm.
but that you have to actively be searching for some sort of way to get out of that, to where it's not just something to where you're stuck in the poverty line and then they're like, well, we'll just give you money, you don't have to look for work. And I think there has been um, policies to where you did have to actively look for work in order to get unemployment benefits.
Mm-hmm.
But once unemployment benefits become more lucrative than work, which is what happened during the pandemic, and believe is still happening to a lesser extent now. That is a disincentive to work, to excel, to get out of that poverty to where you're just stuck under a mountain of free money and you're just complacent in it.
Okay.
Where if you have that economic atrophy, if you don't have the pressure to succeed, then you're just going to stay just above the poverty line and government handouts.
Well, I would say, I always hear about this argument that the thing holding back the black community is welfare, stuff like food stamps. But I've never quite understood that point. For
Mm-hmm.
one, it completely erases, like, the many factors we were just talking about, from segregation to Jim Crow and the current evolution, mass incarceration, to name a few things. But looking at the argument itself, I don't understand how a black person in the inner city who's living in poverty, who's in desperate need, is
Mm-hmm.
held back by not starving because they have food stamps, or by being able to go to a hospital because they have Medicaid, which is our largest welfare program, and I'd say, frankly, one of the most valuable. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the only potential arguments I can hear against it that make somewhat sense, is that some of these programs, maybe not all of them, if you're benefiting from them, you may be afraid to go beyond the limit, the means tested limit. Uh, Otherwise, you're gonna lose them. Now, while I don't
Mm-hmm.
imagine that would be the case for everybody, or even most people, I can imagine that there is a situation where some people are like that, where they wouldn't want to, like, lose their Medicaid, for instance. And I looked into, like, the highest income to qualify for Medicaid. This is from healthinsurance.org, the federal poverty level. So it says, so in a state in the continental U.S. that has expanded Medicaid, which includes most but not all, a single
Mm-hmm.
adult is eligible for Medicaid in 2021 with an annual income of $17,000. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so essentially, you got to be real poor to qualify for the biggest welfare program in the United States. So I can understand the argument that, hey, maybe these people would try to stay poor, otherwise they might lose their health insurance. And frankly, if you're making $20,000, good luck getting health insurance. Uh, I think the average cost or per capita of health insurance is around $10,000, or healthcare for Americans is $10,000. So if you're making $20,000, that's half your income right there going to a private health insurance plan. It's very much a scam there. But the point being, I think that there's a simple answer to stuff like this. We should either raise the limit or get rid of many of the means testing. So Medicaid, for example, our largest welfare program, we can get rid of the means testing by potentially um, doing Medicare for all, a single payer program. Even two-tiered would work better than what we have now, and that gets rid of the limit, and that then gets rid of that artificial, like, risk of, hey, if I go too far in life, I might lose my Medicaid. Now, once again, I don't know if that's the situation for everybody. I'm sure it's the situation for somebody, and I think that that's the only legitimate argument I've heard against welfare. But if we get rid of that line, if we get rid of the means testing and we just have universal health care, then the issue with Medicaid, or potential holding people back, goes away. Um, so one of the biggest problems with our welfare system, we just eliminated if we were to do my approach for that specific issue.
Mm-hmm.
Does that argument make sense? Like,
Yeah. I really, I really just want there to be incentive to succeed than have the like the fear to succeed. Yeah,
well, what
I
holds
want
back
incentives to
success?
succeed rather than the fear to succeed. Because
Yeah.
in this case with our current model, sadly, there is a fear to succeed because then you have the risk of failure, and then you just drop right back into um, problems. Um, God forbid, below poverty. But
Mm-hmm.
I really want there to be an incentive to succeed rather than a fear to succeed. And I think that um, welfare and this kind of economic atrophy, it not only puts a fear to succeed, but it also weakens people's drive to succeed. That's just what I find, because if you have this guaranteed safety net to where you're always getting the paycheck, regardless of what you do, then there's no real incentive to get more than that,
I
especially if it's working for you.
I do strongly disagree with
So,
that because I think when we look at the economic situation of America, what exactly is holding people back? Well, I don't think it's welfare that's holding people back. I think it's lack of economic opportunity that's holding people back. I think it's outsourcing good paying manufacturing jobs in the Midwest that's making people leave the Midwest, or making things like the opioid epidemic a problem. Because people lose opportunity to get paid well and get decent benefits and all that stuff because certain private corporations want to go overseas and make an easier buck using foreign labor. And then we look at some of the more popular or the biggest hirers, the biggest employers in America. It's not things like GM like it used to be. It's not these decent paying jobs. It's corporations like Walmart. It's corporations like McDonald's. It's corporations like Amazon that all pay these jobs that simply do not pay well and do not provide a high quality of life. Um, so the thing is, we look at the data. Economic Policy Institute has done this study where we see since the 80s, uh, economic productivity has gone up. People are working hard and they're working as hard as ever. The problem is that wages have stayed stagnant. So if wages, generally speaking, in this country are not rising, but cost of living is continuing to rise with inflation, and the jobs that are present are not the jobs that provide good benefits or good pay, well, then we have a situation where people are not just not succeeding because they're on a welfare program, but they're not succeeding because, in many cases, if you're like in the middle of the country and the only big employers you have are McDonald's and Walmart, you don't have an option to succeed. Um, so when it comes to something like a government program to social programs and stuff, I would argue that many of those programs increase the chances of success because it gives you more opportunity and freedom to take risk. So let's say we have Medicare for all, for instance. Right now in the current system, many people have healthcare tied to their employers. So let's say you're working at Walmart and you got the Walmart healthcare. You're not getting paid well. You're not moving up economically. Maybe you got some kids and it's really costing you and straining you. Well, if you had Medicare for all, you're guaranteed healthcare. Your healthcare is not tied to your employer, and you save. According to some research, the average household would save $2,000 if we had a Medicare for all system. So you're saving money that would have otherwise gone to copays or premiums or deductibles, and you're not tied to either you're gonna work for a Walmart or you're gonna go a couple weeks, if not months, without health insurance. That's not holding you back. That's not limiting you. You can take more risk in life, whether that's trying to change employer or whether that's trying to start a business and be an entrepreneur. You know, other ways welfare. There's been research done. UBI, universal basic income. There's been research done on that. There's been some cities done where families or people were given the UBI and then they were observed to see what they would do with it. Now, if we were to go with conservative framing of what a standard welfare user probably looks like, the conservative idea of a welfare user would probably be someone that gets that money and gets that government check and then goes to the liquor store and gets like some booze. But what the research done on UBI showed is that many of these people were not doing that. They were as productive as ever. It's just that they were not tied and limited to the 9 to 5. They were able to take more risk, like I said just now. So it's not welfare that's holding people back. It's the lack of opportunity all around this country that's holding people back, in my opinion. 50% of people in 2019, would you say in 2019 the economy was booming? Because a lot of conservatives seem to have that mindset.
mm,
This is like before coronavirus.
Hmm. I don't know. I was in high school when I saw all the now hiring signs out there. I was like, it's going to be an amazing time after high school because I got all sorts of options. And then COVID hit, but luckily I was still able to find a nice job actually,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
with the civil engineering company. So I was
Mhm.
very lucky.
Yeah.
Um, but then I still see there's still now hiring sites everywhere. I'm like, shoot, what's going on here? Just went through a recession. What's going on? And then I realized, oh shoot, no one's at work
Well,
because
we are still in the recession. We haven't necessarily gotten out. Recessions don't end in like a year, but
yeah.
but I would say, well, many people had this opinion of the 2019 economy being booming and successful. The thing is that half of all workers in America were making under $35,000 a year. Now, I'm trying to imagine living in that situation. Imagine making $30,000. Let's say your rent is like is $1,000 a month. That's $12,000 over one third of your income going to rent. That doesn't even include things like the bills, the water, the electricity, internet bills. That doesn't include things like gas and all that stuff. So
Mm,
half of workers are making under 35,000. So many of that 50% are making 30,000, 20,000, 10,000. This
okay.
situation, in my opinion, that's what's holding people back. The fact that they don't have the opportunity, and government involvement in the economy, I think, would be beneficial. Not necessarily at like a
Mm-hmm.
complete nationalization or government takeover, but if we raise the minimum wage to $15, we're not necessarily going to make people break over that $35,000 line, but we're going to make a lot of people making 15,000, 10,000 increase their wage to like 30,000, for instance. So that would be a big jump. Plus, it would encourage companies in general to move the minimum wage up. Other things like the welfare programs. If we have Medicare for all, you can go see a doctor. You can get your health taken care of before it gets to something bad. If we had
Mm,
college for all, that means you're not spending uh, every semester a couple $1,000, especially when a lot of people don't have a couple $1,000 to spare. That's money being saved to you. Plus, that opens the door for many of the so-called 21st century jobs that require a college education. That opens economic opportunity to that person right there. Um, there's a ton of other things that we could do. The child tax credit. If you're a parent and you get a tax credit, you get money and support for having a kid, and that burden's taken off your back. You have universal pre-K. These things are being proposed in the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package. Universal pre-K, so that you, if you're a single parent, don't necessarily have to be around your kid all the time. You can go to work. Um, Stuff like that. And this is all government involvement. I mean, a conservative could probably call this big government and try to make it sound scary, but I think all these things would give people more opportunity, more freedom, and make less people. Uh, and if we're gonna look at like things like the specific communities, make a lot of minority communities have opportunity like they never had in the past.
mm.
Are these
All
ideas
right.
like agreeable and stuff?
Um, so on the $15 minimum wage and college for all. $15 minimum wage I find is a bit it has to be done in a certain way. I don't think it should be a minimum wage for every business. I actually think that there could be a striated minimum wage based on what certain businesses can afford. For example, Amazon, big companies, Walmart, um, McDonald's, all these big companies can certainly afford a $15 minimum wage. But you have smaller shops, smaller chains, mom and pop shops that cannot afford a minimum wage of 15 bucks. So where you can have a striated minimum wage that takes into account how certain businesses profit margins would relate to a certain minimum wage. So you see certain businesses, if you set a $8 minimum, if you set like a $15 minimum wage to certain businesses, and then you see they can't actually afford that. They tell you, I can't afford a $15 minimum wage. Either I'm going to have to fire people or I'm just going to close my business entirely. And then you could have this back and forth where you say, okay, what can you afford here? And then that would put the impetus on the business to look at what they can afford and say, all right, this is what I can afford to pay my workers. And you can put the minimum wage a bit higher than that, or you can put it a bit lower than that and give them incentive to say, all right, keep your wage above this minimum
Mm-hmm.
here, and you'll be all good. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that a striated minimum wage based on what businesses can afford would be a better option than a straight flat $15 minimum wage, because some
Uh-huh.
businesses can afford it, some businesses don't. And I'd rather have people get a job that businesses can afford to give
Mm-hmm.
than not have that job because the business can't afford to give.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say with those $15 minimum wage arguments, I think Ro Khanna was speaking to Ben Shapiro. Ro Khanna is a representative, a progressive who I definitely respect. Um, one of his arguments was one of the beauties of the minimum wage is that it encourages people that are not just making like $7, and it's not just going to raise their wages, it's going to raise the wages of people making 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, or excuse me,
Mm-hmm.
14. And the thing is, when it comes to the issue of the certain businesses that might struggle to afford it, the government can step into
Mm-hmm.
there too. I understand that I'm saying government this, government that, but the thing is, government's already involved so much in so many ways, um, that frankly, investing in our people is not the biggest investment our government would be undertaking. So if we have the $15 minimum wage, gradual one. Bernie was proposing a gradual one. Bernie wasn't proposing $15 in a year. When Bernie was running for president, he
Mm-hmm.
was proposing like over the next 4 years of his presidency, if he were to have won, you would have seen raises going up, just like how the Florida minimum wage uh, uh, amendment was planned. But we can easily settle with the problems with potentially businesses struggling through things like tax credits or grants. We can definitely afford it if we can pay billions of dollars into oil subsidies, billions of dollars into subsidizing essentially the entire military industrial complex. We can afford to subsidize struggling small business. And then the good thing about this is that these small businesses get to then say, hey, we're going to pay you $15 an hour, if not a little more. And then that encourages companies like McDonald's, who, like you noticed, there's now hiring signs, a lot of people not getting jobs. It will encourage them to increase benefits and pay. So they have to compete for workers. It's not just workers making it's not just these companies getting to overpower the smaller ones. So it puts more of a competitive ground, in my opinion. But essentially, the problem of small businesses struggling, I don't think is necessarily a problem because we can help out with grant and tax credits. In short.
More government dependence. That's what we're scared of.
It's not government
Government
dependence.
dependence.
If we need to use the government to provide human freedom, I think that's good because I mean, if our strategy is just get the government out, get the government out, get the government out, then okay, we're gonna get rid of the antitrust laws. Then that hurts small
Um,
businesses. Then we get rid of uh, the FDA. That potentially makes.
there we go. There we go. Hold on. My idea of regulation. This is what happened when I watched your debate with Alex. He was
I'm
just
surprised you.
ridiculous.
I'm surprised you watched that. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. He was just ridiculous. He did not understand
Really,
anything. Yeah. So
people.
so I find, of course, we're gonna spend taxes, get taxed. Taxes
Yeah,
are immortal. Benjamin Franklin said that taxes are immortal.
yeah,
So it's all just about how we use taxes, and I find that taxes should be used in a way that that benefits everyone
yeah.
because we all pay taxes. But what we have a problem with mainly um, is government spending our tax money willy nilly on, let's say, handouts for what we would consider their constituents,
Mm-hmm.
like sadly Black communities, minority communities, and poor people. That's what we as conservatives do not like at all.
Yeah.
We love road, we love utilities, we love because we can all use it. We can all use it equally, but we just don't like it when we have government using the tax money we all have, because the idea of Medicare for all, I explain it as basically state-run insurance because it's a pool that we can all use if we have an
Yes.
emergency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That I completely understand, but the thing is that, well, the first one of the first problems I imagine is you would run into a problem with the people who don't want with pro-lifers don't want to pay for abortion because there would probably be abortion in the healthcare
Mm.
that would come from the Medicare for all system. But the idea of it being an insurance pool makes total sense. The thing that we just don't like it when the government spends money willy-nilly on things that we know that either we're not going to use or we know is specifically being used for people who they know that are going to vote for that's really our main issue when it
Well,
comes to how our taxes are used.
yeah, yeah. So I would say, first of all, it's you mentioned you watched my debate with Alex. It's really interesting because that was such a long time ago, and
Mm,
you know, frankly, that wasn't my best performance. But I appreciate you saying that Alex was being silly because I think any objective person that touches grass and goes outside is probably like, really, you're saying no taxes at all? That's fucking insane.
mm,
But but also, like, I do admit my performance wasn't that great because Alex is a debate bro, like an internet debate bro, and he's good at what he
mm,
does. But I came in there kind of with like the mindset of like, okay, I'm just gonna talk to a person that's libertarian. I'm probably gonna agree on things like drugs or war and stuff. It's probably gonna be a decent conversation. Wasn't
mm,
that? So
no,
I've had conversations with other libertarians more recently, and I would say I've been around this debate bro sphere since that point in time, and I've gotten a little
mm,
better. Um,
absolutely.
but I guess addressing the point still, I appreciate you siding with me marginally more than Alex. Um, but the point of like the cost, we don't want taxes being spent willy nilly. I think you would find a
Mm,
lot of progressives really agree with that. I don't necessarily think that people disagreeing about where tax money is being spent would be like the biggest problem of a program happening. Like you mentioned, like the people that are pro-life would be mad about Medicare for all potentially going to something like Planned Parenthood. Well, progressives are outraged at the idea of going to war. Frankly, it's not just progressives, it's almost everybody in this country hates the concept of war, hates these drone strikes, hates these civilian casualties, but we're not having a mass movement of people that are stopping paying taxes or bombing IRS buildings because we're going to war and stuff, you know? So I'm sure
mm,
maybe some pro-lifers will be mad, but I don't think that'll stop the program from happening. But in the
mm,
broader point of tax money, we got to be careful with it. I agree. I agree. And the thing is, when you look at Republicans and Democrats, especially establishment Democrats, corporate Democrats, and essentially the entire Republican Party, they are never asked a question for anything they propose. How will you pay for this? The only
mm,
people asked that question are American progressives. Progressives in the American system, rather. So
mm,
what that means is that with the spotlight and the scrutiny much more on that movement, they've done the research. They've looked at
mm,
the plans. They've done the math. So let's just pick some things from the Bernie Sanders agenda. This is from video from 2 years ago by commentator David Pakman, and he put the links in his video. So I would say like, and he's a pretty trustworthy guy. He's a good reputation. So we'll go with these numbers. So he says some free stuff from liberals. So this is essentially some big parts of the Bernie Sanders agenda. Medicare for all, he says, would cost 1.2 trillion. Tuition-free public college would cost 80 billion. Paid family paternal maternal leave would cost 32 billion, and Social Security expansion would cost 120 billion. So total 1.4 trillion. So how do we pay for that? Well, we could reverse the Bush tax cuts, which if for some context with Bush, remember he did tax cuts and then proceeded to go to war. So he cut revenue and then proceeded to spend a ton. He was not asked how he pays for that. He just kind of did it. And that tax cut, if we reversed it, would provide $488 billion a year. If we reversed the Trump tax cuts, which over 80% went to the top 1%, we would be getting
mm,
$164 billion a year. If we ended the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and technically Biden did half of the work here, so good on him, that would give us back $127 billion a year. Um, Things like a carbon tax, $73 per ton, which would overwhelmingly uh, be put on the backs of large corporations that put out carbon, would bring around $300 billion a year. Um, Things like a employer payroll tax, exempting the first $2 million in payroll, So not screwing over a small business, you have to be making millions upon millions of dollars to even be affected by this tax, would provide $390 billion a year and saves businesses, according to David Pakman, $9,000 a year average. A
Mm,
wealth tax could provide $275 billion a year. This would be a small percentage of wealth making above 50 million, a billion, or stuff in that range. This isn't like some like taking all the money from the rich and giving it to welfare programs, but this is just many ways that we can raise money,
mm,
raise revenue, or simply get the revenue back that was taken from the pool. And when you add all this stuff together, I'm sure all the stuff I just listed could probably pay for the Bernie Sanders agenda right then and there. Though there is like six more things that I didn't even say, but I don't think we really need to get to all of them at the moment. But essentially, the point being that progressives have had scrutiny on them since forever. How do we pay for
mm,
Medicare for all? How will it cost? How will this? How will that? Well, there's been research done by Yale that shows it would
mm,
save $5 trillion. Medicare for all would save $5 trillion in national spending. The University of Massachusetts finding that it would save $5 trillion as well. A meta-analysis looking at 22 different studies finding that Medicare for all, what in a majority of those studies, would save money to the tune of trillions. And of course, when you have people having health care, it saves lives. When you have medicine costs being lowered, the people that are dying because they're rationing their insulin, their lives are saved. So you save lives, you save money. The scrutiny is on us, and then we have taken that responsibility to do the math ourselves. And
mm.
I provided you with some data showing that progressive policies can be done. And we can do a number of other things to raise money. In fact, since we were talking about welfare earlier, there's this idea of the welfare queen. A person that just is grabbing money, doing nothing, and they're just surviving through the government. Well, I mean, when we look at the cost of different welfare programs, so something like let's say food stamps, right? So
Mm.
when we look at the cost of food stamps, I see here a number showing that that is around, hold on, for whatever reason my browser's really zoomed in. I have this data pulled up on my phone. But and children assistance is around, it's $268 billion. Meanwhile, like I said, the Bush tax cuts alone are worth over $488 billion. We have subsidies for oil and fossil fuel companies that are $26 billion. The point being, the real welfare
Mm.
queens are those on top. That's who the current government has been looking out for, and they've been looking out for those people since at least the 80s, probably beforehand. And what progressives are pushing is change. Redirect the
Okay.
focus away from corporations and to the people. And we should invest in America.
All right. Yeah, I've always had this because I find that establishment Democrats and even established Republicans, it's all optics. It's all just showing that we care about what you think in some way. So when it comes to raising taxes for the rich, I always find that yeah, they're raising the taxes, but you know how many loopholes there are for their accountants to get past that? Like, what's the point of raising the taxes if your
Well,
accountants can
one
find
of
a
the
way to
big
get
things
around
would be to try to, if we had like a Bernie administration, one of the big promises would try
that?
to be to limit the loopholes. And there's different ways
Yeah,
you can do it, but yeah.
yeah. I would think there wouldn't it just be a flat tax that says this is what you're taxed and be done with it because there's no loopholes there. It's just a straight statement. Because when you have so because yeah when it comes to Medicare for all, when it comes to taxation, the complexity is what fucks everyone up. The complexity is ridiculous. If you just had a simple pot to where if you have an emergency, you get money out of the pot and they pay for it. If you had a simple tax where you didn't have all these loopholes, then you wouldn't have all these problems to where you'd have to dig through people's IRS taxes to find, oh shoot, they went through some loopholes here and they didn't pay enough. That is just the most annoying thing ever. So any sort of simplicity, whether from some sort of new Republican who's like, I'm going to simplify everything, or even just a, a progressive that's going to simplify everything, I think that would come a long way to fix a lot of the problems.
Uh-huh. Well,
Um,
I think
when it
that
comes to
I think that that specific issue has definitely been talked about. And that specific issue has definitely been addressed. So I agree that I don't like the idea of how we're doing how we do our taxes. It's unbelievably complicated for whatever reason, and
Mhm,
people try to find their ways to get around it. In some countries, I remember reading about this. I don't have the country right in front of me, but there are some countries where you as far as I know, I may be wrong,
mhm,
but I've heard there are countries where you are simply sent a bill, essentially, saying this
mhm,
is what you got to pay in taxes. It's already been calculated for you. This is what you, with your work, with this, with all these factors, this is what you got to pay. And then
mhm,
you pay it. I don't
mhm,
know what country that is. I don't remember exactly where I heard that from. I remember hearing it fairly recently, but not recently enough that it's fresh in my mind. But I definitely
mhm,
agree with the idea that we should simplify how we pay taxes because
mhm,
there's no reason why it should be complicated. But also, how are we ever going to get to that point when we had when frankly there the reason why I said establishment Democrats earlier, and I separated between progressives and establishment Democrats, is I believe
mhm,
that there's a real, genuine fight in the Democratic Party of what the party should look like. Should we look like the party of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or should we look like the party of Bill Clinton? So that civil war is happening. But with the Republicans, I mean, there's a lot of heated rhetoric. Mitt Romney and Susan Collins doesn't like the rhetoric of Donald Trump, and then Donald Trump is consolidating a personality called essentially in the party. There's that
mhm,
battle going on, but it's not a battle about policy, it's a battle about aesthetics. But at the end of the day, these people, like Liz Cheney, she votes with Trump 95% of the time. So on policy, they agree, the establishment Republicans and I guess the more Trumpian Republicans. And then when you
mhm,
had a pseudo populist who promised he was going to be something different, who promised he was going to drain the swamp like Donald Trump, enter the White House, what he did was put literal Goldman Sachs bankers, as well as people like Betsy DeVos, who spent her entire career trying to privatize schooling and owns not just one, not just two, but multiple yachts. And those yachts have been shown to have flags of like the Cayman Islands. Why? Because they're registered in that country so that they can avoid taxes on that yacht. I think
mhm,
that there's things like we can put pressure on these tax havens and say, hey, stop being a tax haven or stop letting our billionaires get away with stuff, or we are literally going to cut off trade with you. We are literally going to cut relations with the Cayman Islands if you continue this nonsense. We can do stuff like that, but we're not going to do it with anybody from the establishment Democrats, which I don't like the establishment. I have been fighting with the establishment since I've even gotten in politics. And even
mhm,
though I will give credit where credit's due, like I like getting out of Afghanistan, for instance, I'll give credit to Joe Biden there. I like the reconciliation bill, I'll give credit there. But there is still a fight happening. But with the Republicans, I mean, there are certain groups, I'm not going to name them by name because, I was asked not to. But certain groups that like to go on college campuses that are funded by the same Republican donors that fund the politicians. And
mhm,
unfortunately, with when it comes to like the energy with young people, the energy of young people are with people like Bernie and AOC, who are definitely against establishment politics. But the energy with young conservatives, the young conservative movement is essentially bought and owned by the same billionaires that own the Republican Party. So the point being is, if you actually want to see like changes to the tax code and simplifications, or just any reform happening and changes happening in a positive direction, the only energy for that is with the progressive movement.
all right. All right. I'll put to college for all now.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So what we are scared of here, what I'm certainly scared of is when it comes to college for all is basically just making it a government funded indoctrination factory.
Uh huh.
Whatever the government's policies, whatever the government's position is, that's what's going to be taught in the school instead of maybe in conjunction with the actual skills they need. Well, I think will be better if we had a more focused trade school for all, if we're gonna do anything college for all, I think it would be better if we did a more focused trade school, to where
Mm-hmm.
you had that. Because me, I went to a high school that actually does trade work. I went into drafting. That's how I was able to get that a really nice job, $15 an hour. So I think instead of having a universal college that is fairly ripe with the ability to um, indoctrinate people, simplest way I can put it, that's what scares us most.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and instead of that, we have very specific skills development that
Mm-hmm.
we know the money is going towards skills development and not teaching the kids some sort of fringe ideology that we don't
Mm-hmm.
like. That is our main thing with college for all. So you think that that could be a good idea? Instead of doing college for all, we could do trades instead.
Well, no, I disagree. One of the thing to address with like Bernie's College for All plan was it would be essentially uh, tuition-free public colleges and universities. So stuff like
Mm-hmm.
the community college I went to before going to the university that we're both going to right now, that would be free of charge. That would be you don't have to like give an arm and a leg to pay tuition. Um, but there would still be private institutions that like I think Yale and Harvard are private. They would still be private and you can still pay into them. But
Mm-hmm.
um as for the point about like indoctrination factories, does that same logic apply for government funded public education from K through 12 in your opinion?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You think that the K through 12 education indoctrinated us?
Thankfully, no. My God, thankfully. There are definitely um, some very political teachers, very political school boards. There's even a law passed here in Florida. I heard it from my English teacher that is basically in an anti indoctrination law to basically just as teach the kids the fundamentals of what you're teaching them. Like for me, I have writing. Instead of teaching us about an ideology that is ascribed to our writing, they just teach us how to write, how to best communicate an argument, and we just go from there to we actually learn those skills.
Well, I mean,
So
through K through 12 education, which where exactly are we learning about ideology in English class? The edgiest thing in English class is uh reading a class reading of how to to kill a mockingbird, and they have that the N word part. But that's like the worst. That's the edgiest thing in the English class from K through 12 education, essentially. I don't remember, and I guess this is anecdotal, but do you
mm,
recall being taught about ideology in English class?
no, thank goodness.
Well, okay.
Like I said, there are. This thankfully is not universal, thankfully, but there are fringe political teachers out there that do want to push their politics on their kids.
Hmm.
And that kind of, luckily, thank goodness, thank God, it is not state sanctioned. But if there's nothing done about it, then we don't want those people to be funded by the government.
So we recognize that this is
So
not like some top like the K through 12 education as we have it right now across
no,
this
okay.
country
So I
is
will
yeah.
concede.
Okay, okay.
I will concede. No, it is not state funded indoctrination, but the teachers that do push their own ideology on kids that just need to learn the basic skills to communicate and do the certain skills like math, like reading, like science, those those kinds of teachers do not deserve any of the government money that goes to K through 12 schools. No,
Well,
absolutely.
okay. So this
And
is the
that's not even a politically partisan thing. That is across the board. A right wing teacher cannot teach their kids about a right wing ideology. Same thing with the left wing teacher.
yeah.
This isn't preferential treatment. This is across the board. Just teach the kids the skills. So yeah,
Well,
that's the way I think.
well, okay. The thing is like so the line gets really blurry. Like we said with like our critical race part of the discussion.
Mm,
A lot of these schools are banning or these states are trying to ban schools from talking about Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham,
Hmm.
Birmingham jail, or his speeches in general. And their justification is not because they hate Martin Luther King. They don't say that outright, but their
Hmm.
justification is we don't want critical race theory being taught in schools. And then when you dig deeper, they're
Yeah.
obviously talking about MLK. Well, why don't you want MLK being taught? But we don't want
Yeah.
ideology being taught in schools. And MLK is obviously a
No.
political partisan himself. Um, so the thing is, I think as someone who is more left leaning, I had conservative teachers growing up from K through 12 as well as
Hmm.
in college. And I'm okay with that because it's
Hmm.
fine to be exposed to these ideas. And especially with a college, uh, it's unavoidable.
Hmm.
I'm in political science, you know? So we're being taught about like the Middle East, right?
Oh,
And
absolutely. I
and
mean,
yeah.
if your main field is politics, I mean, of course, I mean that's just common sense. You got to learn about politics and political science. But in classes that don't deal with politics, no, please, my
Well,
God.
okay, well, like if
Le-
in a regular like a substitute teacher in like high school, right? I think
yeah.
genuinely one of the things that was eye opening for me. I
Hmm.
had this perception with abortion growing up that I didn't like it, but then as time going on, I was kind of more like, okay, well, at the end of the day, it's a freedom thing for me. I don't want the government interfering and preventing people from getting abortions. But then, but I was still more like in the middle on the fence. I didn't really care that much. But then there was a substitute who was just talking, and he was talking casually, and he mentioned like abortion, and he was talking about it, and he's like, you know, in my opinion, if we pass anti-abortion laws, it doesn't get rid of abortion, it just puts it underground and harms more people. You'll have more dead women in back alley corners. And that wasn't part of a lesson or anything. He was just talking. But under what you're saying of uh people like him should not be getting any government money, people like him should not be getting paid. But for me, in my opinion, I think that that was a pretty useful perspective and a pretty useful argument. And it really put my position where it is right now. I want less harm done to people, so I don't want dead women in alleyways. So the point being that I'm trying to make right now is that I'm not opposed to politics being discussed in schools, even if it's just being discussed casually, because no matter your age, maybe not when when you're in elementary school, you probably can't process it. But when you're in middle and high school, if there's a bit of a political discussion happening, like let's say like a civics class that's a political debate, or even an English class who's
Hmm.
reading political text, start allows their class to have a debate. I think that that's completely fine, even if it's ideological. And for example, with the substitute that I was talking about, if you disagree with his perspective about um, abortion laws killing women, essentially, well, that's okay. That's completely fine, and you leave the classroom with your same opinion. You're not necessarily indoctrinated. No one's being punished for it. Um, so when it comes to though public colleges and universities, going back to college for all, I don't think that 4 year free public college would become this sort of indoctrination factory. Yes, I will admit concepts like CRT, among other ways of analyzing laws in society, will be taught not necessarily as classes per se. Maybe there's somewhere there's a CRT class, but probably as part of a bigger sociological major, you're gonna have to discuss CRT at some point. But that isn't indoctrination. That's just learning. Um,
Hmm.
you just learn about a way people analyze things, and you don't necessarily end that conversation having to agree with that. Um, in fact, when we look at our university, for instance, I don't want to say the name because I don't want to like I don't want to like I don't want to like share any of your personal information or anything like that. But our university right now, like they emphasize the diversity, but they're not some like liberal safe space or like haven or anything like that. You look at the student body
Hmm.
president. He recently did like his video making fun about Chinese people. He gets in trouble with the general student body. All the diversity groups are like, what the fuck? He goes to a meeting around those people and makes a fool of himself. Absolutely sounds like a complete clown. And frankly, he's not going to get suspended or expelled. I don't want him to, but he's not going to get. It doesn't seem that the staff is taking an opportunity to say maybe a guy that makes this kind of content about Chinese people shouldn't be representing such a diverse community. The point being is our school, as much as they emphasize diversity, they're not some like super liberal, super progressive institution. The runner of the certain college conservative group that I'm not
Mm,
going to say by name, but the advisor, you know, there was a whole controversy about him with his speeches and writings about the civil rights movement and transgender people. And a lot of students wanted him to resign. And I get that some people will say, well, that's cancel culture or something like that. But I understand the arguments. If you don't like trans people, how are you going to teach a trans student, for instance? But the staff didn't do anything to punish him or reprimand him or anything. He's still working there and he's still sponsoring this club. And that is what it is. It's fine. But the point I'm trying to make is that our campus, who claims to, who emphasizes diversity and all that stuff, who on the aesthetically seems pretty liberal, they're not like some indoctrinating factory, the one that we go to. I don't think around
mm,
the country that a lot of universities are these like liberal indoctrination factories. Now, some people might go in and come out more left leaning, but I suppose that's what happens when you're taught about the real world, when you're taught about the struggles, when you're taught about colonialism, when you're taught about political theory, that your opinion shifts. But that's life, you know? We can't just say we shouldn't fund education because some people will change their minds over years. But I mean, when we look at the benefits of college for all, one, I don't think it's going to be an indoctrination factory. And two,
mm,
the economic opportunity that I was discussing earlier that was holding people back, I feel would be expanded through something like College for All because it would give people access to the new jobs of the 21st century. So a factory could be built in America today. Most likely that factory will not be as simple as the factories in the past. It won't just be an assembly line. It'll be an assembly line of robots and engineers having to deal with it. But to be an engineer, you need an education. So having these
mm,
free colleges and trade schools would provide an education that would allow you to work at a factory even if you aren't necessarily doing the assembly line work, because you
mm,
have to take care of the robots there. So it opens doors and does it. And like, look, when it comes to 21st century jobs, it's either it's divided in two areas. One area is the things like robotics, engineering, technology, coding, all that stuff, computer work that you need a specialized education for that free college would provide you. And two is the jobs that you don't need any specialization in. Uber driver, delivery dudes, all that stuff, where they're
mm,
pushing laws around the country to make it so these people aren't even considered workers and don't even have to be paid a minimum wage. So there's two job opportunities being made for the 21st century. I would much rather push people or allow people to get a college education so they can go with the uh, earlier one, which would be modern technological specialized education required jobs, and stuff like and free college would provide that. Sorry if I said a lot. I just speak a lot.
No, no, you are fine. Like I said, I can't think of my feet very well.
No problem.
So the idea of I so yeah, college for all. I certainly understand how much more demanding the the um, the workforce is nowadays. So I certainly understand that. Next in my topics here for what I put on the Instagram, let's see the conservative position on socialism and communism and why they scare us.
Yeah.
So when you had your conversation with Alex and you defined socialism as the dictionary definition, when the workers own the means of production, I
Yeah.
believe. What I've wondered many times is this whenever that has allegedly been practiced, whether
Mm-hmm.
in Cuba, Venezuela, USSR, China, it has devolved from the idea that workers should own and take the risk of building a because what I find is good about the idea is that it it puts the risk on the workers to make the business succeed. So it's not just the CEO and the stockholders putting pressure. It's the actual workers who are like, we want bigger paychecks and we want this business to succeed.
Yep.
So, but then this is when government steps in. This is when the revolutionaries step in these historical examples that say, all right, we're going to get you what you want. And then finally, when they take over, they subsume the actual workers and say, no, you put us in power, so we are the workers now. We own the means of production.
Uh-huh.
And that's how you get that state capitalism. So my question would be, how would you stop that from happening? If you were to get this socialism where you would actually have the workers on the means of production, how would you stop that kind of taking over of that mission from the people to the government? How would you keep that from happening?
Mm-hmm. Well, for a quick clarification, I personally don't identify as a socialist. I identify as a social
Mm-hmm.
democrat. I believe in social democracy, meaning I still fundamentally believe in capitalism. I'm perfectly fine
Okay.
with like hierarchies existing within these private businesses that makes like final decisions left up to like the CEO. I understand how something like that could be harmful to the workers, but I think that government interference preventing the bosses from like insane levels of exploitation, like paying them crumbs or making them work 100 hours a week. I think that things can be done. I think we can provide. I listed a ton of other programs that I want to do to expand opportunity and all that stuff. So I'm still fundamentally a social democrat. But if we do want to look at the conversation about socialism, right? So, and I know it's cliche. You hear conservatives make fun of it all the time when someone says socialism hasn't been done before. You know what I mean? That's a
Mm-hmm.
bit of a joke in the conservative community. But at the end of the day, like, if we actually want to look at things by definition, um, we in America in the West, we looked at the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War, and they called themselves socialist and they called themselves democratic. Chomsky brought this up. We laughed at the idea that they are a democracy because, I mean, they frankly were not. You know what I'm saying? They did not match the definition. They the USSR and China both have their ways of democracy. I've interacted with people that argue that this is democracy because you're still voting for something even though the only choice you got is from the Communist Party. I don't consider that democracy. And most of America did not. And we laughed at the idea that they're democratic because it just doesn't fit the definition. But we accepted the idea that they were socialist because it fit our political narrative that socialism equal bad. So even though that the workers definitely did not have any control of the means of production, and things were not being decommodified or anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
at a degree that many socialists would want, we still called them socialists. But I wouldn't describe any of those places from being socialist. But how do we prevent something like a socialist situation from becoming this authoritarian mess that was the USSR, that is China, and that is like places like North Korea? How do we prevent that? Well, I would say that if we are in a situation where workers actually own the means of production, they control it, then you're not necessarily going to get a situation like the USSR or China. Because in both of those situations, the workers never own the means of production. China has unions, but I believe those unions are literally controlled by the government. The worker co-ops in China are run by the government. At the end of the day, all these businesses and stuff over there, they have a CEO. These worker co-ops, even though they want to be run by the workers, they have a CEO. The CEO's name is Xi Jinping. So
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally, you cannot have worker ownership of the means of productions and an authoritarian strongman government. It's undoable. But how do we get to a place where, again, I'm not trying to even get to this place. I'm just trying to represent the
Mm-hmm.
socialists well. But how do we get to a position, let's say like someone like Vosh who wants market socialism. Um, he doesn't want to decommodify everything, and he still wants, or he would still push for technically these private institutions, even though they're worker run, to exist and compete and all that stuff. How do we get to the market socialist goal? That's what I'll try to answer. Well, I would not say that we should do what a Marxist Leninist wants to do, which is do a revolution. Because when you're doing a revolution, when there is chaos, you need a strong government, or your government will fall apart. That means like when and I get it that in many places the conditions that cause revolution are very different and some are justified. But in the United States, for instance, we'll focus there. If we want to see a market socialist United States, we can't just have a revolution and overthrow Congress, you know? We can't do that. But we can follow the lead of like the Democratic Socialists of America and people like Bernie and AOC. While they push social democratic policies, that's part of the theory of change for democratic socialism. is it's not just a jump to a socialist future. It's a process. You can't go from like having a Reaganomics and neoliberalism and immediately jumping, boom, we have worker ownership of the means of production. It's not going to happen. So what democratic socialists, their theory of change is that, yeah, we're going to do these social democratic policies. We're going to move gradually left. We're going to move gradually left. We're going to move gradually left. And then we'll have a situation where we could potentially pass legislation to increase the amount of worker co-ops or something like that. And then we can sort of naturally move towards a system where worker co-ops are the norm and where workplace democracy is expected. Now, do I personally feel like there's a need to get to that position? Frankly, no. If you have workers represented in like corporate boards, if you have all these strong social programs to make sure that if you're a poor person, you can still succeed if you put in the work. If we have a situation where the disabled and the sick can be cared for even if they can't work, I'm satisfied. But if we want to ask the question how we get to democratic socialism, or what the democratic socialists want, how we get to socialism through democracy and not through revolution, then social democratic reforms would be the way. Don't jump to revolution, because when you jump to revolution, it's chaotic. Now, for socialists, my kind of paradox for them, and I've never, frankly, I haven't talked to much socialists about this, but they never quite answered the question of this to me. When I have, is when you do like social democratic reforms, you better conditions, and then you lessen the need or the demand for more of more revolutionary approaches like changing our economic system. So if you're now, there are people that are accelerationists, that are a fringe tiny minority that are not represented anywhere in real life politics, that think we need to make conditions worse to spur the revolution, to start the revolution, to spark it. Now, most socialists I know would completely disavow that. That's disgusting. We should not be making conditions worse. But then to the decent socialists out there, people like AOC, Bernie Vosh, and other friends of mine, I don't quite know how we get to a situation like market socialism when we have something like a New Deal that's making people's lives better, that lessens the calls for revolution, whether it be right-wing revolution or left-wing revolution, and where quality of life goes up and people are satisfied. I don't think we're ever really going to get to a point, and some socialists would disagree with me strongly, but I don't think we necessarily need to go to socialism to have a decent conditions for majority of people. I think we can live lifestyles if we do adopt like the social democratic reforms Bernie Sanders pushes and I push. We could be all, frankly, living a lifestyle, or have the chance to live a lifestyle that would be considered utopian 100 years ago, even if it isn't socialism. But yeah, I mean, once again, you're not talking to a socialist here, so. But I hope I did answer your question from the socialist perspective.
Certainly, I probably should ask an actual socialist, but that's definitely a worthwhile answer there. And then lastly here, our view of limited government. When you were talking about regulation, especially with Alex, someone thought that regulation was bad. What I find is the most important thing about regulation, because many people will reference at a time when there was no regulation, when there was nothing to say to businesses that they could do whatever. Because when Alex wanted to say that people should do whatever they want with their capital, and that because we can't do whatever we want with their capital, it's not capitalism. First of all, he should have just called it should have just agreed it's called a mixed economy and leave it at that.
Yeah.
But
he wanted to play semantics the whole debate. We didn't even. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt. I'll say this quickly, and then we're gonna get back to your point. But in the Alex debate, I wanted so hard, and you saw me like pushing, like, "Hey, Alex, what happens if like you're a person that works at Walmart? You get injured, you can't work, you don't get paid, you lose your house, and you got a family. What happens to that person, Alex?" And he kept saying, no, we have to go down. You have to agree with me on the definition of capitalism, even though it's a fringe anarcho-capitalist definition that nobody outside their shitty little insular circles fucking use. It's insane.
Yeah.
I would love for Alex. Oh, by the way, Alex seemed to have quit. I don't know what happened to him. Well, he just stopped posting everywhere. But I would love for Alex to go to like a well-spoken, well-read college professor and try to say, we don't live in capitalism, professor. The
Oh
philosophy of
man.
capitalism disagrees with you. I'm like, okay. Well, the majority of the world agrees with me. So I don't care about what Milton Friedman has to say. But anyway, going back to your point.
But yet, when it comes to regulation, when it comes to people being able to use what they own, their capital, they can use it how they want to a point, and that's where regulation comes in. Now, regulation to me, and I think to most people who want good regulation, is a moral kind of legislation that says your what you choose to do with your capital, what you choose to do with what you own, does not come before human life. It does not come before the life of the people that work for you. So, in the worst case examples of polluting a river, of having terrible air quality, of having an unstable factory that could catch on fire and there are no fire escapes. In this case, people back in the day would be like, there was no regulation, so there was no one to tell them, hey, this building is terrible. All they knew was this building was cheap to make, so it maximized my profit.
Mm-hmm.
Regulation is there to legislate, in this case, a morality that says no, your human life does not come before profits. Where I find regulation becomes detrimental is the immediate when the immediate effects of the regulation outweigh the future benefits. This is specifically for environmental regulation. Now, want to concede, yes, there is a global warming that's happening. There is a climate change that's happening over time. But the idea that we can legislate regulation now that harms people in the immediacy for that causes people to lose jobs, that causes certain companies to not be able to make the kind of capital to actually innovate the way they use their capital, like their coal, like their natural gas. That kind of regulation harms people in the immediacy, and it outweighs the potential benefits of the future. So that's where I think regulation becomes an issue, is when it immediately hurts people now and it outweighs any, because people only think in the now. I find that Republicans think in the past too much, Democrats think in the future too much, while most sane, rational people think in the now. How does this law affect me? How does this regulation affect me? If this regulation affects me by cutting my industry into quarters and making me lose my job because now the company that employs me lost money because they had to cut down, they had to do some sort of innovation that was forced on them, then yeah, that's an immediate thing that people don't like. So I find that regulation should be used to legislate a sort of morality that is immediate, that says that the immediate effects of you not securing your factory, the immediate effects of you poisoning the river, it outweighs any sort of benefit you get profits.
Mm-hmm.
That's my basic idea of regulation there.
Well, I would say, specifically trying to address like environmental regulation. So like certain environmental regulations, for sure, if done improperly, could harm people in the immediate uh future. Not something far out, but like immediately people could get harmed, right? But I think that it's important to push smart policy in regards to stuff like climate change and stuff, because we have a crisis. I think I don't remember the institution, maybe the UN released another report saying that holy shit, things are really fucking bad. Once again, things are really bad. We're seeing natural disasters happening like crazy. Places that don't get flooded are getting flooded. Like the heart of New York is getting flooded. Certain areas in Central Europe are getting flooded. California and the Western United States is always constantly burning every single year.
Mm.
It's the next hottest year on record. Like this is insane. This is really bad. So I think that we do need big options, or big and bold plans, like we're fighting a war. like how America mobilized during World War II. And going back to that time period, that brings us to things like the New Deal, which prepped us for World War II. And then that also brings us to the Green New Deal, which is one of the biggest issues, or one of the biggest policies being pushed in America today. So, I mean, looking at what Bernie was pushing, he wants to transform the energy system 100% to renewable, which would create 20 million jobs. So we're concerned about the potential of losing jobs. Well, we could be creating 20 million jobs with a Green New Deal. We would also, and this is super important, prioritize many of the fossil fuel workers. So with the fossil fuel workers, we would have a transition. As Bernie wrote, the plan will prioritize the fossil fuel workers who have powered our economy for more than a century and who have often been neglected by corporations and politicians. Well, specifically, they will guarantee 5 years of current salary, income, housing assistance if needed, job training for new work, healthcare, pension support priority, job placement for any displaced worker, as well as early retirement for those who can no longer work because of things like if you're a miner, black lung or something, you know. So, I mean, and there's a ton of other things that are super beneficial. Obviously, 20 million new jobs through a Green New Deal. Let's just say, let's do a little math here ourselves. Let's say that you get $25 an hour, 40-hour work weeks. So that's 12. Hold on, I have done the math there wrong. 25 times 40. 1,000 per week times 4, 4,000 per month times 12, $48,000 per year. It isn't huge, it isn't gigantic, but it's definitely an improvement from making under 35,000, which a majority of people make. Now you employ 20 million people. It's a lot of people. It's a big investment. And that'll be for paychecks alone, $960 billion in paychecks. Sounds like a lot, but it's important to recognize that, number one, we spend tremendously already. We can talk about the trillions of dollars spent in war over the last 20 years. We can talk about trillions of dollars spent in bailouts. We can talk about all that stuff. We can talk about the trillions of dollars we're going to be spending on our current military. We can talk about the trillions of dollars that we're losing from like the Trump tax cuts and the Bush tax cuts. So really, this is a $960 billion cost. Was a $960 billion cost over years, and directly into the paychecks of Americans, which is, imagine a small community with little economic activity, and then the people in that community get to work in this field, and they're getting investments directly through their paychecks. They're getting to spend it within their community, or they can save that money and grow their generational wealth. The point being is, number one, like I said earlier, progressives always have a plan on how to pay for things. And number two, a lot of these progressive policies, like Bernie's Green New Deal, specifically keeps the economic impact it might have, the negative economic impact it might have, in mind, and plans for the plans needed to help workers that will be struggling because of economic or environmental reforms. So those people are considered. Those people will be cared for. Plus, you get the huge 20 million job investment that will be transformational to people that need work. And also, we'll be doing our part in lowering the carbon emissions that are out here. And by the way, an important point, transforming our energy system with 100% renewable, that's really important, because frankly, if we wanted to solve climate change worldwide, all we really need is to end human dependency on fossil fuels. That's all we need to do, because 70% of carbon emissions are being put out by 100 corporations, and some of those corporations are state-owned, but nearly all of those corporations are energy companies, oil and coal, from across the world. So if we want to dramatically lower our carbon output, we need green energy, and the technology, we have it. It's apparent. We can do it if we are willing to invest it. And it seems that a lot of other countries, whether we're talking about Germany or even China, are putting the money where their mouth is, and they're essentially clicking the spam button when it comes to things like solar panels. And what they're doing is getting rich from it. Why is it that America, we're number one in the world? I genuinely love this country. I want this country to succeed. We should not be playing we should not be sitting on the sidelines during this moment when much of the world wants to avert crisis, and we can make millions upon billions of dollars creating jobs and making sales and of green energy. And yeah, like I said, your point that was really important was, what about the people that are going to get hurt because of these regulations? Unlike the establishment Democrats' approach, and unlike the entire Republican Party's approach, the only people to care for the people that might get hurt by their policies are once again within the progressive movement.
Okay. All right. With these, was it 20 million or 200 million jobs? I'm not sure.
20 million.
20 million, 200. 20 million. These jobs are going to be created. How are they going to be filled? Exactly.
How are they going to, like, how are people going to go to them?
Yeah. How are people going to be trained to fill these jobs, fill these roles, and go into them? Because you'll have 20 million jobs, but if no one's in there, you didn't really have 20 million people. So how would they do it? Would that be something that would be figured out?
I think that.
Or.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Like, basically, have they planned for how they're going to fill in those jobs yet, or what?
I'm sure that they have. I'm sure that there is like job training, obviously, in the same way that like how were like the FDR's New Deal's jobs filled. You know, you obviously gotta like train your workers how to use a jackhammer. You're probably gonna have to train your workers on how to put in a solar panel into like the top of a roof. You know, but so they'll have to be trained, but I don't think that much of the work in infrastructure is work that you have to get like a college degree for, you know? So I think that it's doable. I think the 20 million number in particular doesn't come from like, okay, we're going to have 20 million jobs that we want to fill. It comes from the estimates of how many people are going to take these jobs. And then what the research probably assumes is around 20 million. So that's where that number comes from, yeah.
What's your opinion on nuclear?
Nuclear, I'm not fully against it. I'm not fully for it. I really have to look into it. There's a lot of people with strong opinions. Some people are like, why are we not using nuclear? It will solve a lot of problems. I think that's potentially true. It could solve a lot of problems. But I am, admittedly, somewhat skeptical. There is that part of me that's just like, I don't want a Chernobyl. I don't want a Fukushima. And so I have like this inherent skepticism of nuclear, but I'm not completely against it. I feel like I just got to look into it more, and I'll see how I feel about it. But I do like using like things like wind, solar, and hydropower, because one, hydropower is pretty damn effective as far as I know. I mean, it's just literally flowing water through giant turbines and constantly spinning. You don't even have to wait if it's like a windy day or wait if it's a sunny day. But also, I like the idea of like these other green energies, hydro, wind, and solar, because even if they are considered less effective than nuclear, I think that there is value in the jobs created in these industries, in creating the solar panels, in creating the wind turbines, in setting them up, that even like we could maybe, I'm just gonna make up numbers here, okay? So let's say like in a situation like where you need 100 ways to power something, you could potentially power all of them with 10 nuclear plants, right? Or you could use like 20 solar panels, 20 wind, 60 dams, something like that. Even though technically maybe those things might be more costly to make and more cost efficient to just do nuclear, I think that the reason why it's costly is because people need paychecks to make these stuff, and then that paycheck though, that goes back into the economy, and I think that has a lot of value. So I want there to be like a strong solar industry, wind energy, and hydro energy in industry. And I'm just generally skeptical of nuclear for safety reasons. Though, look, I'm not taking a hard stand on nuclear. I think that if we do need to work fast, which it does seem like we need to do, and the other options are not fast enough, even though I think they will be fast enough, then I would probably be fine, if proven safe, to push nuclear heavily. But yeah, not against nuclear.
All right. I've had this idea when it came, because I really don't mind. I really love solar. Jesus, I love solar a lot. I
Yeah,
find that it is a very interesting um, way because the sun will pretty much always be there. The only difference is whether it's cloudy or not.
yeah.
So, but when it comes to wind power, I've just heard too much about it being fairly inefficient. But solar, I find that it just works so well. So what do you think about decentralizing solar? Because I've always thought of this idea of having some sort of way to incentivize individual people to put solar panels on their houses.
Hmm.
Like not have big, large solar farms that's controlled by one company or one state, but have everyone have their own little power production plants at their house. What do you think about that? Because I find that that's a very that seems like a very useful way to decentralize power and probably avoid having like centralized power problems like we had sadly in Texas, like we have in California with rolling blackouts like that,
Uh-huh.
to where you won't have one thing getting shut down and then everyone loses power. You just have like someone has power, and even then it'll foster community spirit to where if someone has a good solar panel, someone has power, and someone doesn't. Let's say you're in a snowstorm, you say, hey, come over here, we've got heating, we've got power, and that'll be a pretty interesting thing. So what do you think about that?
I'm not completely against it. I actually do like the idea of like having power being provided directly in a building, right? So like getting your
Mm-hmm.
solar power directly in your house or getting in so directly to your business. I do like that idea for sure. Um, though I'm not opposed to big solar farms. I do like the idea of stuff like that. And I think that when it comes to like the crisis at hand, though, I don't think that we can just depend on incentivizing. Now, at a local level, let's just say you're in local government, right? You're not
Mm-hmm.
going to do a Green New Deal for the entire United States if you're like a mayor. But something like that incentive program could be a really good idea for someone like a local government. If they could provide like some sort of benefit, some sort of incentive for individuals to make their businesses and homes solar powered or hydro powered or wind powered, whatever, green energy powered, I think that that is a decent approach. I think that's a really
Mm-hmm.
good approach for a local government. I like that a lot. I personally thought of stuff like that. Um, but I do think on like a wider scale to deal with like the environmental crisis, I do think that we need things like the big solar farms or the big hydroelectric plants and stuff of that nature, and does probably it should be run by the government as well, because I think one of the problems in California, right, is that they a lot of their power is run by a private company as far as I know, and that private company is not willing to put their lines, their electric lines, underground because it would cost money. It would be a big investment. Now, the problem with that is that these lines that are above ground and exposed spark fires. So that's one of the big causes of fires, and it's because the government doesn't intervene and say, "Hey, we're either going to nationalize you or we're going to put you or you're going to put your stuff underground for safety reasons." So that lack of regulation right there is causing some problems for California, but not necessarily because um, energy is provided by in a wide scale. So I think okay. So in short, I really like the idea of like decentralized power. I like the idea of homes having solar panels of their own or having some sort of way to make energy on their own. Uh, I feel like that would save individuals money. You know, you're not having to pay anything to FPL. You know what I'm saying? But on a wide scale, because frankly, most people aren't going to do that, even if there are incentives. On a wide scale, we should just change our general power grids to green energy, so we're not dependent on fossil fuels. That's my main
Mm-hmm.
priority.
Okay. Um, and I think one fundamental disagreement we have with the environmental idea is whether it's a crisis or not. I find it's not a crisis in the sense to where we don't need to panic about it. We just need to think about it rationally. What has happened when you think of it as a panic is it seems like a grab for um, power over people who blow up the climate to an exorbitant proportion, to where you have these kinds of big Green New Deal scary packages to where we either don't know what's in it or we do know what's in it, and then the climate alarmists, as we call them, um, tell us that we need everything in this bill, every single thing, and we're like, hold on, take a look at this. Do we really need this? Do we really need that? Let's take a deeper look at this. So I find that the messaging on the climate, it really shouldn't be a crisis. It should be something we keep in mind so that we have rational idea of what we can do. Sure, we can do big things, but they need to be thought through very, very carefully. I'm not sure if you think that because I find that these things need to be thought through very, very carefully. Because if we move too big too fast, then we'll have problems with the now that people will remember even in the future, to where they see that like 100 years later they hear about all these great Green New Deal things that happen that cause their an ancestor of theirs to lose their job, and sure they gained another job but it wasn't as good as the one they were doing, and then later they find that barely anything has changed, and then like, well, what was the point of all the Green New Deal nonsense? What do we? Nothing's changed.
Well, okay, okay.
All that for
The thing
so
is,
that's what we're really
yeah.
scared of there.
The thing is, like, well, addressing that, like, last point with the New Deal, things did change, like, dramatically. And I mean, eventually, like, there were, like, some economic troubles in the 70s, and then that made people put in someone like Reagan, who completely shifted our direction of our economy towards a neoliberal direction, unfortunately. And where people are in much worse conditions now than they were in, like, oh, okay. If you're a person of color in America in like the 50s and 60s, you're probably in a better condition now, even though you're still probably struggling. But in general, most Americans at the time were doing better and had more opportunity post the New Deal and pre Ronald Reagan because of the effects of the New Deal long term. So like I'm sure there's somebody that